It all started when my friends and I stumbled upon pictures of this abandoned mansion just 10 miles north of Toronto. A mutual friend had recently gone there to explore, and the photos he showed us were strange. The house looked immaculate, almost too pristine for something that had been left unfinished and untouched. The exterior was nearly complete, with tall pine trees surrounding the property like a natural fence, giving it an eerie sense of isolation. The inside looked half done, as if construction crews had vanished overnight, leaving tools and materials scattered. The more we talked about it, the more curious we became. My friends, James and Paul, were just as intrigued as I was. So, we made a plan to check it out for ourselves. One Saturday afternoon, we hopped in my car and drove out there. The ride wasn't long, but the further we went, the more desolate the surroundings became. When we pulled up the long gravel driveway, a chill ran through me. The place looked exactly like the pictures, standing tall and almost complete, yet abandoned in this eerie silence. The only sounds were the soft crunching of gravel beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Our friend had told us how he got in, through a back window in the kitchen that hadn't been locked. So, we made our way around, and sure enough, the window was still slightly cracked open. One by one, we squeezed inside, dropping down onto the kitchen counter. The first thing that hit me was how strange the place felt. Everything was so clean, almost untouched, except for the scattered cabinet doors and the occasional pile of drywall and tools. It was like stepping into a time capsule, like the workers had been planning to come back any minute but never did. We all exchanged nervous glances. This was going to be one hell of an exploration. We decided to split up and explore the house. James and Paul headed off in different directions, but I found myself drawn to a long hallway lined with doors. Most of them led to unfinished bedrooms, their walls only half covered in drywall and littered with tools and debris. As I passed each one, the air felt heavier, the silence settling around me like a blanket. At the end of the hall was a door that stood out. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dark, narrow staircase spiraling downward. I called out to James and Paul, letting them know I was heading to the basement. A faint acknowledgement echoed back, though I couldn't tell which one of them had answered. With that, I stepped through the door and onto the spiral staircase. The further I descended, the more isolated I felt. By the time I reached the bottom, the door at the top was lost to the shadows above me. The basement was huge, bigger than I expected. It was unfinished like the rest of the house, with stacks of drywall, wooden planks, and other construction materials scattered all around. My flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that made the space feel even more vast. I wandered deeper into the basement, my footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. As I moved into a back room, I noticed several large storage containers lined against the far wall. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started lifting the lids off, one by one. The first two were filled with random building supplies, nails, screws, wooden planks. But as I approached the last one, I heard something. A soft bump came from inside the container, like something had shifted. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably a small animal, maybe a raccoon, or a rat that had gotten trapped down here. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the lid. As soon as I touched it, the lid moved by itself. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, falling hard onto the cold cement floor. My flashlight flickered for a moment, plunging the room into total darkness before it blinked back on. That's when I saw her. Inside the container, peeking out from the crack in the lid, was a woman. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, like she had never seen sunlight. Her eyes were wide, crazed, and locked onto mine with an intensity that froze me in place. Her lips stretched into an unsettling grin, and she whispered in a voice so soft and cold, it felt like ice against my skin. Then she laughed, a hollow, eerie sound that echoed through the basement, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I scrambled backward on my hands and feet, she started to lift herself out of the container, her bony fingers gripping the sides as she pulled herself up, her eyes never leaving mine. I bolted for the spiral staircase, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step felt like it stretched longer, the distance to the top growing impossibly far. The only thing I could hear, aside from my own panicked breathing, was the soft creak of footsteps behind me. Her laughter followed, growing closer and closer, each giggle a twisted echo bouncing off the basement walls. She was right behind me. I didn't have to look to know. The icy whisper of her voice was filling my ears, muttering words I couldn't understand, words that felt ancient, wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. I reached the top of the stairs and threw myself against the door, pounding on it with both fists. "James! Paul! Open the door!" I screamed, my voice shaking with desperation. I kept slamming my fist against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard the soft click of her shoes on the spiral steps, growing closer. Her laughter had become a soft, sickening hum, and I could feel her eyes burning into my back. Finally, the door flew open, and James's hand shot out, grabbing my arm and yanking me through the doorway, just as I felt her cold breath at my neck. I stumbled forward, barely able to stand, and turned back instinctively. For a split second, I saw her. She stood at the top of the stairs, her pale, emaciated figure bathed in the dim light from the hallway. Her face was twisted into that same horrible grin, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Time seemed to freeze. She didn't move, just stared, her lips twitching like she was about to speak. Then I slammed the door shut, locking it. Without a word, we sprinted for the front door, my legs shaking beneath me. We didn't care about being careful, didn't even bother closing the door behind us. We just ran. The mansion, that strange, beautiful shell, felt like it was alive, like it was breathing us out. When we finally reached the car, we collapsed inside, gasping for air. None of us spoke for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by our shaky breaths. I stared at the house through the windshield, trying to process what had just happened. That woman, or whatever she was still down there. And that's when I made the worst decision of my life. "I can't leave her," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. "We have to go back." Paul shook his head, eyes wide with fear. "Man, no way. We're not going back in there." But James, his face pale, nodded slowly. "We can't leave her locked in there. What if she dies?" Against every instinct screaming at me to just drive away, we headed back. The walk up to the house felt heavier this time, like the air itself was pushing against us. When we reached the front door, we paused, exchanging nervous glances. Then we stepped inside. The silence was deafening. We made our way cautiously down the hall, back to the basement door, and there it was, wide open. We stopped dead in our tracks. I was absolutely certain we had locked it. My hand had twisted the lock. I'd felt it click. But now, the door stood ajar, revealing the dark, gaping maw of the basement beyond. I didn't need to say anything. We all felt the same dread creeping into our bones. Without a word, we turned and ran, back to the car, back to safety, back to where the daylight still felt real. I've never returned to that mansion, and I swear to you, I never will. Whatever was in that basement wasn't human, and it wasn't meant to be found. When I was a young kid, my family lived in a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood where the houses were big and spaced out, with well-kept lawns. The one that always caught my eye, though, was the mansion across the street from our house. It was huge, towering over the other homes, and it felt like it didn't belong. From my bedroom window, I had a clear view of its many windows, which always seemed dark and empty. The street was always so calm that my friends Daniel, Lucas, and I would play soccer right in the middle of it. We had our own version of the game, making up rules as we went since it was just the three of us. One sunny afternoon, we were playing as usual when the ball got kicked onto the mansion's yard. I volunteered to go get it. As I walked up to the property, something made me glance up at the windows, curious if the owner might be watching. That's when I saw him. There, in one of the upstairs windows, stood a boy, about my age, staring straight at me. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I quickly grabbed the ball and hurried back to my friends. "Hey, have you guys ever seen the kid who lives in that mansion?" I asked. Daniel and Lucas both shook their heads. They hadn't. I looked back at the window, but the boy was gone. At first I brushed it off, but the image of him just standing there stayed with me. Something about the way he looked down at me felt off. A month went by, and the strange encounter with the boy faded to the back of my mind. Life went on as usual, and I had almost forgotten about him. Then, one afternoon, I was in my room playing Nintendo when I got up to grab something. Out of habit, I glanced out the window, looking across the street at the mansion, and there he was, the same boy, standing at the same upstairs window, staring right at me. My heart skipped a beat. It felt like his eyes were locked onto mine, even from that distance. A cold, unsettling feeling crawled up my spine. Without thinking, I backed away from the window, the controller slipping from my hand. Why had I never seen him outside? I couldn't remember ever seeing anyone from that house. It was like the mansion was always deserted except for this boy who only ever appeared in that one window. Something didn't feel right. I asked my parents about him that evening. "Hey, do you guys know if any kids live in the mansion across the street?" They looked confused. My mom furrowed her brow. "No, I don't think so. We've never seen kids there. Pretty sure no one's lived there for a while," my dad added. The pit in my stomach grew deeper. If no kids lived there, then who was I seeing? The next time Daniel, Lucas, and I were playing soccer, we were talking about needing a fourth player to make the game more fun. That's when the idea struck me. Maybe the boy would want to join us. I ran across the street, my heart pounding as I rang the mansion's doorbell. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 50s. She looked a bit tired, like someone who didn't have many visitors. "Hi," I started nervously. "Does your son want to play soccer with us?" Her face changed immediately. She looked at me like I had just said something terrible, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "My son?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Yeah," I stammered, feeling more awkward by the second. "The boy who's always at the upstairs window. We could really use a fourth player." The color drained from her face. She stood there for a moment, frozen, before quietly saying, "I don't have a son." I felt a lump in my throat, but I've seen him. He's always at the window, looking out. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, she motioned for me to follow her inside. I hesitated, but stepped through the door. The house was quiet, eerily so, and it smelled faintly of dust and something old. She led me upstairs, her footsteps slow and deliberate. When we reached the second floor, she opened the door to one of the rooms. The same room where I had seen the boy. Inside, it looked like a boy's bedroom frozen in time. Toys neatly arranged on shelves, a bed with colorful blankets, a few posters on the walls. But everything was layered with a thin film of dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. The woman walked over to a dresser and picked up a framed photograph. She held it out to me, her hands shaking. "Is this the boy you saw?" she asked quietly. I looked at the picture and felt a chill run down my spine. It was him. The boy I had seen in the window. I nodded slowly, and the woman's face crumpled. A tear rolled down her cheek as she whispered, "That's my son, Marcus. He died 10 years ago." I stood there, speechless, as the weight of her words sank in. Marcus had been dead for a decade. And yet, I had seen him, clear as day, staring at me from that window. The woman explained, through quiet sobs, that she had been alone ever since losing her son, Marcus, and her husband. She didn't share many details about how they died, but the sadness in her voice was unmistakable. As I stood in that dusty, untouched bedroom, looking at the photo of Marcus, the boy I had seen at the window, a sick feeling settled deep in my gut. There was no way I could have known about him. My parents didn't even know about her son. The fact that I had been seeing him, a boy who had been dead for 10 years, was too much for me to wrap my head around. I had heard ghost stories before, but they never seemed real. Until now. This was different. I had seen Marcus. Not just once, but twice. And each time he seemed so real, so alive, just standing there at the window, staring at me. I didn't want to believe it. But the woman's story left me with no other explanation. The thought of seeing a ghost, of Marcus still being in that house, was terrifying. The sadness of it all, of his mother's pain, made it worse. The house wasn't just a mansion anymore. It was something darker, filled with memories that refused to rest. After that day, I tried not to think about the mansion, about Marcus, or the boys' room I had stood in, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Months passed, and I thought maybe I'd finally put it behind me. Then one evening, while I was in my room, I made the mistake of glancing out my window again. It was a habit I hadn't quite broken. My eyes drifted across the street to the mansion, and before I could stop myself, I looked up at the same upstairs window. He was there. Marcus. Just as he had been before, staring down at me from across the street. His face was expressionless, his eyes unblinking. A wave of dread hit me harder than ever before, and I froze. He was watching me, just like he had all those times before. Only now, I knew. I knew what he was. My chest tightened with fear, and without thinking, I leapt forward and slammed the blinds shut, my hands shaking. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing in my chest, too scared to move or look again. I never opened those blinds again after that. Even now, years later, I still think about that house, about the boy who never left. The memory of those empty, staring eyes chills me to the bone. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still there, standing at that window, waiting for someone else to notice him. I was hired to house sit for a friend of a family friend who was going away for a week. Let's call it Mansion Sid, because, seriously, this place was enormous, and the family was loaded. The mansion sat on the wealthiest side of town, right on the edge of a pristine lake, and staying there felt like a dream. I was 22 at the time, and the idea of having a whole mansion to myself was too good to pass up. There were only 2 rules: no parties and no more than 2 guests at a time. That sounded more than reasonable. The father, George, left me a simple list of tasks: feed the 2 cats, water the plants, and keep an eye on things. Nothing major. They even offered me one of the guest bedrooms, so I wouldn't have to drive back and forth every day. I was more than happy to stay there for the week. The first day was uneventful. I arrived late, did a quick walk around the house, and got settled in. The next morning, after knocking out the small chores George had left for me, I decided to take advantage of the pool. It sat in the backyard with this incredible view overlooking the lake. Even though I was house sitting, I couldn't shake the feeling of jealousy. It was just too perfect. As I swam, letting myself soak in the quiet, something made me freeze. I glanced up through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the living room, and that's when I saw it. Someone was walking inside the house. I jumped out of the pool, heart pounding, and grabbed a towel before rushing inside. My mind was racing with all kinds of possibilities. Was it an intruder? A neighbor? But when I got into the living room, it was empty. I hesitated for a moment, then went to check the kitchen. That's where I saw her. She was a woman, Hispanic, probably in her late 30s or early 40s, standing there like she'd been waiting for me. My heart slowed down, but only a little. I asked who she was, trying to keep my voice steady. In broken English, she introduced herself as Bethany, the maid. She said she came every day to clean the floors and that she had her own key. It seemed strange that George hadn't mentioned her, but at the time, I didn't question it too much. I was just relieved that she wasn't some random intruder. I introduced myself and told her to go ahead and clean. Trying to shake off the weirdness, I went back to the pool to give her space to do her job. A couple of hours later, I took a shower and fed the cats and parrots again. It wasn't until I was drying my hair that I realized something strange. Bethany had vanished. I hadn't heard her leave or seen her since I'd gone back outside. But honestly, I didn't care too much. I wasn't in the mood for awkward small talk, and it didn't seem like she spoke much English anyway. That evening, I had 2 friends over to check out the mansion. I made sure to follow the house rules, keeping it to just the 2 of them. We played some pool and air hockey in the game room, and I told them about Bethany scaring the hell out of me earlier. That's when my friends looked at each other, and one of them said, "That's kind of weird, right? Why wouldn't George tell you there was a cleaning lady?" At first, I brushed it off, but they had a point. So, just to be safe, I sent a quick text to George, asking about the maid. Hours passed, and I didn't think much of it. I figured he was busy or out of signal. But later, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. It was George's reply. It was short, but enough to make my skin crawl. "What cleaning lady?" Immediately my phone rang. It was George. His voice was tense, almost panicked, as he asked for every detail. When I described the woman, her thick accent, her claim of being the maid, his concern deepened. "There was no cleaning lady," he said. That was the whole reason they hired me. My stomach dropped, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. George quickly told me to lock myself in a room while he called the police. My hands were shaking as I bolted the guest room door, sitting on the edge of the bed with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Every creak and groan of the house made my heart race. Minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally I heard the faint wail of sirens approaching. George stayed on FaceTime with me the whole time, trying to keep me calm. When the police arrived, we searched the house from top to bottom together, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. But there was no sign of Bethany. The officers suspected she had slipped in while I was outside by the pool and fabricated the story to blend in. They made sure all the doors and windows were locked before leaving, reassuring me that the house was secure. I spoke to George for a little longer after the police left, his voice steady but concerned. He assured me that everything was fine now, and I just needed to relax, so I locked my bedroom door again, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in the pit of my stomach. The house was too quiet, and every tiny noise set me on edge. That's when I heard it, the faintest creak, like the sound of wood straining under pressure. It was coming from beneath the bed. My blood ran cold. I froze, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, but the noise came again, clearer this time, a subtle shift, like something moving on the hardwood floor under me. Trembling, I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, lowering myself to the floor to peer beneath the bed. I wish I hadn't. There, crouched in the darkness, were 2 people. Bethany and a man, much older, his hand tightly clamped over her mouth. Their wide, unblinking eyes stared right into mine. For a moment, none of us moved. Then I screamed. I scrambled for the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. I could hear them moving behind me, crawling out from under the bed. With a desperate lunge, I yanked the door open and bolted down the hallway, barefoot and terrified, sprinting out of the house and straight into my car. I didn't stop to think. I just drove, my heart hammering in my chest until I was far enough away to call the police and George again. When the police arrived for the second time, they did another sweep of the house. But once again, Bethany and the man were gone. No trace of them anywhere. The officers speculated that they might have been casing the place for a while, knowing the family was gone, and that I had probably left the front door unlocked while I was in the pool. They were never identified, and no one saw them again. I didn't spend another night in that house, and the family cut their vacation short flying back the very next day. To this day, no one knows who Bethany and the man were or how they got in. All I know is that for a brief, terrifying moment, they were right there, under my bed, watching me, waiting.